Since this is the first time that many of you guys will be seeing me, I just want to introduce myself really briefly. My name is John Kudrowski. I grew up in Minnesota. I moved to Hawaii in 2008. I've been teaching since 2001. I've had a variety of different experiences. I started in Duluth Public Schools and then moved into some different private schools out here in Hawaii. I've gotten into international education, project-based learning. And as you can see, I like to travel. I've got 2 children. I'm married. Been married for 15 years, and we like to have a lot of fun together. So hopefully, some of this transfers into the lesson that I'm about to share with you. I've discovered that in my years of teaching, that the most important part of delivering a lesson is the preparation that goes into getting the lesson to the point where you actually teach it. So we call this backwards design. It's really important. It's something that I really believe in and use as part of my practice. And I have been incorporating more and more electronic tools to do this. So the first tool I wanted to share with you is Google Docs. And what I do with my lessons is I organize them in units, and I've got all the units organized in Google Docs so that they're easily seen by me and other colleagues and administrators. I can share each one of these files with them so that they can look and see what I'm doing in class. If I open up one of these files, and this is a lesson I'm going to be getting into more, I've got it split. I've got old assessments so I can see old student work. I've got places where I can see the things I'm using to assess all of my rubrics, and I've got resources for all of the different lessons and that I'm going to be using. One of the unique things that I do is I'm a lesson planner. And so I make sure that before I start any lesson, I have all of the key information that I need to cover kind of at the beginning of my lesson plans. And this gives me an idea of how I want to actually, like, what is my end goal with all of this? So if I'm teaching to standards, if I'm teaching IB, I've got all of this stuff at the very beginning, and that allows me to scroll down, and you can start seeing here are the lesson plans that I've got for the entire unit. They're all written out beforehand, and I really like this setup because it allows me to get into each one of these lessons after the fact and start thinking about what worked and what didn't work, what needs to change, so that I can make those changes and improve year after year after year. Another tool that I use in my teaching is the class website, and what I try to do here is make sure that, especially at the beginning of the year, all of the lessons and all the assignments that I have, I put them into the website so that the students can see what they're doing and when they're doing it and what kinds of things I'm going to be covering and teaching before they actually go into class. So one of the pre-study works that I try to encourage in all of my students is to actually go and check the website before we actually have class, so you can see what are we going to be talking about, what kinds of things do they need to prepare, what do they need to bring before they even start class. And so what I try to do is have a detailed calendar for all of my students so that they can see here's the lesson, here are the different assignments, here are when they're due, and you can see that this goes all the way from the beginning of the term, in January, all the way through to the end of the term in May. And I clearly differentiate between the different kinds of assessments, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but these are called formative assessments, and these are the parts of getting to the point where you can take a summative assessment, and this is where I'm actually going to be assessing against the criteria or whatever standard that I'm going to be teaching in that unit. Another tool that I use in my classroom, and I introduced this at the beginning of the year, is Google Classroom. Google Classroom is a powerful tool of work management that helps students with especially students with executive function issues, because it allows the teacher to send out electronic copies of every single assignment that they give, and the student literally can't lose it, because what we're doing when we're sending this out is that I can use this tool and create every single assessment that I'm using. And it creates a folder in my Google Docs, and when I open up this folder, every single assignment that I've given is listed here, and I actually own all of the documents that the students are using. So when I open this up, I can immediately access one of these Google Docs. I can open this up. I can give them feedback basically in real time as they're working. I can see when was the last time that they were working on it, and whether they're putting in the time to make things that they need to make happen in class. And so this is hugely important to my practice because it allows me to give the students who are independent the ability to go off and do that and do the work anywhere they need, but it also allows me to monitor the students who need that extra effort to, really look at what they're doing and make sure that they're keeping on track. Whenever possible, I try to use a model called project-based learning when I'm constructing my units. And this allows me to think about what is the end product that I want the students to produce, and does that fit the standards or whatever criteria I'm using to measure whether or not they're learning. Okay, so project-based learning is important because it gives students the ability to do a lot of hands-on work, but it also gives them the ability to think about how to work with others and practice some of those what I guess we call them soft skills in the education lingo, and but they end up being the hard skills that you use in real life anyways. So project-based learning is something that, as you can see, I've got this whole classroom filled with tools and other things like that. So students can come in here and they can expect to have to think about what they're learning in terms of content in such a way that they're immediately going to use it and make something that's going to help them solidify that content in their minds when they're done with the project. Another thing that's very important to my practice is the concept of formative and summative assessment. So I just wanted to walk you through how this works in my classroom. As I was saying before, I have a real detailed calendar that I use with all of my students, and I put in all of the lesson plans beforehand. And what I try to do is I try to help the students understand that there's two different types of assessments that we do in class. There's the formative assessment, and they have a darker green one, at least in this calendar, that we call a summative assessment. And the difference is this. A formative assessment is what you do when you're actually trying to see if somebody is learning it as you're learning it. Okay, so for example, if I'm teaching a karate class and I show somebody how to do a kick, okay, I'm going to be giving them some feedback on how to get better at that kick as I go, as they're doing it and learning it and learning it and learning it. And that's the point of the formative assessments, is to give feedback so the students can improve what they're doing so that they can take that and eventually say, okay, now you're going to be tested on that kick to see if you can pass the next belt level. And the next belt level would be the summative assessment. That's a formal mark in learning that we're trying to see whether or not they're learning what we want them to learn. And what we try to do with formative and summative assessments is change in real time to help our teaching get better. So if somebody is doing poorly on formative assessments, what we can do is we can change how we're teaching in the moment to help them understand better. And if somebody is doing poorly on summative assessments, what we can do in that case is that we can take that information and start thinking about our teaching in its totality so that we can help the student get better as the unit progresses in a whole. We sort of look at the big picture then, okay? And so that's another important thing that I wanted to convey before I get to the actual lesson. This lesson is a middle school lesson. I want to walk you through the parts of it so that we can kind of understand how this works. And what we teach here, what I'm currently teaching is that we have block scheduling and we have 85-minute periods. And so typically with every lesson, I start with some kind of way of breaking the ice, some kind of icebreaker. I'm typically And on this website, I can actually click here, and that will open up the question of the day. Students can use their electronic devices to answer the question. What I'm asking in this case is, why do humans make tools? And so we start to explore the idea of how humans have used tools. And then at this point, I can introduce the content that I'm trying to get at in the lesson. And in this case, we're teaching Newton's laws, and we'll just cover it in a basic way and try not to beat it to death right out of the way. Because what I want the students to do is to just let that sit in the back of their minds and start thinking about it as we go through. Now, part of this lesson fits into kind of a larger framework. And what I'm going to ask the students to do is utilize something that they have been making up to that point. In this case, we are working on hand slings. And the idea here is that the project that we're using, like the bigger picture, what we're trying to get at, is I've had the students measure how fast they can throw a tennis ball, how far they can throw a tennis ball, and how basically how accurately they can throw a tennis ball. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and create some kind of invention that can do that better in at least 2 out of 3 of those ways. And so we have to take that and eventually measure whether or not it's doing better. And so this is where we can get into some of the dimensional analysis and all of that. And that's going to be eventually become the summative assessment. Okay, so we take a look at, here's the data that we collected of how a human can throw just unaided, and then we can create something and see if we can collect the data to show that it's better when we use some kind of a tool. So what I do in this lesson is I've had the students make hand slings, and then we go out and learn them, and then we try and figure out how to make them work and how they actually work in terms of increasing the amount of force that you're using. So in this lesson, what we do is I'll have the students go out to a field. I'm going to show a video of this in a little bit. I have the students go out to a field, we practice using the hand sling, and then I videotape each student as they're using the hand sling. And so as they go through and they use it, they kind of practice it, I'll take a video of them, and then I'll bring the video back, I'll hook it into my computer, and then we'll slow down the video. We'll hit it in slow motion so that students can see their actual technique as it's going. And then we can start to talk about concepts like the unbalancing of a force. So when is the force unbalanced? When you're throwing it, and how does that affect the trajectory of the flight? And I think what this does is it gives the students the idea that this is meaningful to something that they're actually doing with their hands, and it connects the concepts of Newton's laws and unbalancing the force to something that they're doing right now. Formatively, we'll assess this. I'll have the students take a look at their own video and think about the unbalancing of forces and look at how they can use that concept to improve their release time and get a better trajectory of the ball. Then, at the end of class, what I do is I'll tie all of this back to the summative assessment that we're going to be giving in a few weeks, so that they understand that the learning that they've been doing up to that point, it connects to what they're going to be doing and what they have to produce at the end. And so the test that they're doing now on looking at the angle and understanding the unbalancing of forces, they can start to think about utilizing those tests in different ways to put together the test that will collect the data that will compare whether or not their creation helps them throw better than unaided. Okay, and one of the tests that a lot of students do is they actually look at the velocity test. And what we do for that is we'll videotape the throwing of a ball, and then we can sort of use that videotape again, put it in slow motion, and if we've measured it off correctly, we can actually start to calculate what the acceleration would be up to the part where it hits a target. And if we can figure out the acceleration, we can measure the mass of the ball, and we can figure out the force, and then we can utilize just those pieces of information to compare, the same sort of test that we did with our hand does it increase the amount of force? And we would use that, showing whether or not it increases the amount of force as their summative assessment. This next lesson is a high school lesson. It's part of a larger project in which we're taking pieces of electronics, broken electronics, and then taking them apart and learning more about how the circuits work on the inside. And what we're going to try to do is take the parts of the piece of broken electronics that we can utilize and see if we can make something that could generate power or transform energy into another form. Okay, so this follows one of the high school standards that your district uses. So if we take a look at this piece, there's lots of interesting things in here, and I think it's really important, especially for high school kids, to start to understand, that there's more on the inside of the black box, and it takes some time to, figure out how that stuff works. Okay, so you get some hands-on experience with real electronics, and just utilizing your own background knowledge. So I'm going to walk you through this lesson so you can get the structure of what this is going to look like. This is how I introduce the lesson. We start with something, it's a question of the day, and inside one of the messages, I actually have a video that I've made that covers something that I've talked about the previous day, which was Ohm's law. This is the basic parts of a circuit, so that the student can understand, oh, this is how electricity works in a very general way. And then what I want them to do is start thinking about how Ohm's law applies in their piece of electronics. So like the previous lesson, what I had covered was, if you look at the piece of electronics and you look where the power is coming in, you can see that it is composed by circuits within circuits within circuits, like circuit conception. And so what I want them to do is review that concept so that we can start thinking about how to make our own circuits and start thinking about how we could actually eventually get to the point where we could build a windmill or some kind of generator. Okay? So after we cover that part, I go into a demonstration of how circuits work, and I've got a lot of different ways of doing this. And typically what I do is I will put the notes in for the students into the website so the students can have access to the notes and they can follow along. And then I have these kits that are already made with the pieces of the circuits that I want them to be utilizing, and at the time that I'm going through it. And so as I'm talking about the parts of the circuits and how to put it together, the students are in groups and they're actually doing that as I'm going through that. So they can follow along in these notes, and then we can wire up the different kinds of circuits. So I can talk about a series circuit versus a parallel circuit and what those two might be used for. And then moving on, I'll introduce electric motors into that. And so we can, if we have any that have been uncovered in our projects, we can start thinking about, okay, how could we hook this up to our circuit and start making it work? And we talk about, well, what is induction versus, so we cover induction and generators and how that applies inside there in kind of a simple way. I don't want to beat the subject to death, but just to make sure that there's always a hands-on component whenever we're covering one of these kind of complex things. And so once we've got that established and once we've got them sort of figured out how to put a circuit together, I'm going to test all of this in a formative way to see if they can actually make the motor that I've given them spin. Okay, so they have to put together a circuit with a set number of components, and then they have to show me before they leave that they can actually get that motor spinning, which is a crucial component of actually making something that can transfer energy from one form to another. And at the very end of class, a lot of times we'll do a reflection to sort of go back to the larger project that we're trying to do. So we'll start thinking about, okay, well, what kinds of parts have we identified in our electronics? And then we'll start disassembling some more if there's some extra time, and continuing progressing towards that and the end goal of trying to make something out of something that's broken. And then, you know, we can talk about some of the social issues about how recycling pieces of electronics is so important, especially when they're using conflict minerals and other things that have this huge social cost.
Oh, that's cool, guys. Like, so it looks like you've made like a drivetrain. I like what you guys did by sort of reversing the direction of the current for that other motor, so it goes in the direction you want it.
So they're opposite, so that they both spin the same direction.
Okay, cool, cool. Let's see, what did you guys make?
You're pulling it along.
Okay, was that a head scratcher?
Head scratcher or hair comber. We haven't put the comb on it yet, though.
So you took the motor assemblage from a printer, and then you...
The part that puts all the ink on the page,
Yeah.
that goes back and forth.
Okay. So we got a nice idea. So